Thank you for standing up for climate and speaking truth. And really, it means a lot.
God bless you. Continue to walk. Continue.
When you try your best but you don't succeed, when you get what you want but not what you need, when you feel so tired but you can't sleep, stuck in reverse.
Los adultos podemos aprender mucho de los jóvenes.
And the tears come streaming down your face when you lose something you can't replace.
Especialmente en estos momentos de crisis, nuestro deber es repensar el futuro de nuestra casa común y proyecto común.
Porque a Amazônia, ela não depende só de mim, ela depende de cada de vocês que estão aí, ela depende de ti.
Reflexionemos sobre nuestro estilo de vida, sobre cómo la forma de alimentarnos, de consumir, de desplazarnos, o el uso que hacemos del agua, de la energía y de los plásticos.
Every time I step, I can feel the earth sigh under my feet.
Pues en todo lo que tiene que ver con el cuidado del planeta, los jóvenes están a la vanguardia. Me alegra mucho ver que los jóvenes tienen valor de emprender proyectos de mejora ambiental y mejora social.
Now, every time I step with a million others.
Just try to be the change you want to see in the world.
La ventana para una oportunidad está todavía abierta, todavía estamos a tiempo. Elijamos cambiar.
Very warm welcome to this event of Catholics at COP26. My name is Bishop John Arnold. I'm the Bishop of Salford here in the United Kingdom. I'm the lead bishop for the environment for the Catholic Bishops' Conference of England and Wales. I've been at COP26 in Glasgow for the first 9 days of the meeting, and then I had to return home. Now, the COP26 climate negotiations are a crucial moment for humanity and our common home. Pope Francis has asked us to take decisive, urgent action to transform this crisis into an opportunity. As Catholics, we have a role to play as well, each and every one of us. Tonight, we're going to be exploring what's happening to our climate and why COP26 is so important. We'll be talking about what has happened so far during COP26 and the outcomes the Church has been campaigning for. And we'll be talking more widely about how we root care for creation in our own Catholic faith and how we can continue to act for climate justice following COP26. This evening's event has been organised by the Laudato Si movement and the Equipping Christian Leadership in an Age of Science project. The ECLAS project works with Christian leaders, people in training for ministry and local congregations, creating opportunities to engage with science and explore what it means for Christian faith and action. The Laudato Si movement is a global movement of Catholics and people of goodwill, responding to Pope Francis's call to act against the injustice of the climate emergency and the ecological crisis and care for our common home. We're joined tonight by an excellent panel of speakers. Dr. Lorna Gold is Director of Movement Building with Faith Invest. She currently serves as the board chair of the Laudato Si movement, formerly Global Catholic Climate Movement, and teaches part-time in applied social studies at Maynooth University. She holds a PhD in economic geography from the University of Glasgow and is a member of the Vatican Commission on the Post-COVID World Task Force on Economy. Dr. Carmody Gray is Assistant Professor of Catholic Theology at Durham University. She specializes in theology and science, with particular interests in life sciences, ecology, and evolutionary biology. Dr. Franziska Colt is a researcher in science communication and the history of science at the University of York. She is a postdoctoral research associate with the Equipping Christian Leadership in an Age of Science project. Lydia Marcacha is the Climate Justice and Energy Policy Officer at SIDSI, an international family of Catholic social justice organizations based in Brussels, and is responsible for coordinating the SIDSI working group and relations with member organizations working on climate and energy issues. She also follows and supports policy processes at the UN and EU level and represents SIDSI on various platforms and ensures information sharing and networking with partners and allies of SIDSI, including the Catholic Church. And then Father Eduardo Agosto Scarel has been a member of the Carmelite Order since 1999. He was ordained a Catholic priest in October 2007. He holds an MSc in Atmospheric Sciences and a PhD in Atmospheric and Oceanic Sciences from the University of Buenos Aires. He's been published in numerous national and international publications. Recently, he has written Climate Change in the Light of Integral Ecology, which is due to be published in the November issue of Melita Theologica. For the first half of our time together, I will ask the panelists some questions. And then we have an opportunity in the second half for questions from the audience. So please type your question in the feed, tell us your name and where you are in the world. And if the question is for a particular member of the panel, please also indicate that. So I'm going to turn now to Dr. Lorna Gold. Dr. Lorna, what's changed since the Paris Agreement of COP21, and why is it so important that we take action now?
Thank you, Bishop John. It's wonderful to be together this evening. I think that it's a bit of a strange time because we're almost at the end of COP, but of course, towards the end of the COP is always a bit of a rush because the negotiating is happening in earnest, and we're trying to see what is going to come out. So it's a kind of pivotal moment. And what has changed? Well, on one level, I would say, quite frankly, nothing. Nothing substantial seems to have changed since Paris, and politically in relation to climate change. Emissions are continuing to rise. Many governments and companies are still investing in fossil fuel infrastructure. Our economy essentially is still being driven by a model of unfettered consumption and extraction. Inequalities continue to widen. And quite remarkably, not one country came to this COP in Glasgow with a nationally determined commitment that is in line with the 1.5 degrees target or ceiling, let's say. We shouldn't never call it a target. It's not a target, it's a ceiling. And currently we're on track for 2.4 degrees, according to a report that came out this week. on the basis of what's been agreed, or what's been proposed here. So it can feel like nothing's changed, but obviously 6 years, there is some positive change. Many countries, there is a much higher awareness of climate change and the science, thanks in great part to the Fridays for Future movement and Pope Francis with Laudato Si. The fossil fuel divestment campaign has really taken off, with $35 trillion under assets now divested from fossil fuels. Clean energy technology is a really good news story. It's been scaling up significantly, costs coming down, and new advances in technology are happening all the time. And we have really new economic models being tested in different parts of the world. For example, circular economy, donut economy, models that can get us some way towards resolving the crises. And yet we are very far from where we need to be at this stage. The lobbyists of those who want to keep us behind, keep drilling for fossil fuels, promoting big agriculture, unsustainable consumption, are alive and well. In fact, there was a report came out yesterday that said there are more oil and gas lobbyists registered at COP26 than there are NGOs, which is quite something. And I think we're in a phase where greenwashing is rife. It's everywhere around us. It's quite subtle, but it's very hard to distinguish what's going on. I think briefly, what really has changed is that the physical effects of climate change are absolutely crystal clear. They're staring us in the face now. So as Mary Robinson said, she made a dramatic plea this evening on the news, where she was very emotional, former President of Ireland. She said that it's under our watch now that this breakdown of the climate is happening. And it's under our watch that countries like China, India, she named and shamed the countries, Brazil, Saudi Arabia, are actively blocking progress in the negotiations. So I think that whilst some things, there is some positive news about change, we know what the solutions really are now. We know how to get there, but there's active resistance, and that has not changed since Paris. So I think that we need to really recognise this, and recognise that there's a good fight that still needs to be fought.
Thank you. Can you kindly share on the Healthy Planet, Healthy People petition and what it's asking, and where to next with the petition and the movie?
So the Healthy Planet, Healthy People petition is was started before this COP by the the Laudato Si movement in collaboration with lots of partners, and we presented the first round of petition signatures, 130,000 signatures, at the COP last week as part of a multi-faith action. The asks of the petition, which can be signed online at the catholicpetition.org, are to tackle the climate emergency and biodiversity crisis as one crisis, to keep warming below to enact actions that will keep warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius and promise no more biodiversity loss, to ensure equitable global action, including support for those most affected. So the question of finance for those most affected, and to protect and respect human rights, including the rights of Indigenous peoples and local communities in the climate and biodiversity action. So this petition, whilst the first round of signatures were presented at COP, continues because, of course, COP15 on biodiversity is happening next year in China, and we intend to keep and to actually now accelerate our efforts in partnership with everybody, with all of yourselves and many others, to really accelerate and to increase this petition, so that we can come to the COP15 with a really strong voice in favour of those really important asks.
Thank you. And just briefly, what are the most important outcomes of this conference in your opinion, and what must COP deliver?
So yeah, I mean, it's hard to say. It's all to play for, really. And at the moment, the draft text of the negotiations came out this morning, and to me, it feels that it's like there are two COPs happening. And the first COP is the negotiated outcome COP. There's at least two COPs happening. There's been the COP that is in the so-called blue zone. And I've been on the inside, and I have to say, compared to other COPs, I've really struggled to understand what's going on. The draft outcome document, it reads reasonably well. There is mention of nature-based solution in the connection to biodiversity. There's a renewed commitment to climate finance. But there's also huge gaps in this outcome document. There's no firm commitment to globally end fossil fuel extraction and production. There's no decision on increasing the frequency at which countries have to produce nationally determined commitments. And this is just meant to be the first draft. The real problem with COP on the inside is that it feels like we've been here before, with promises, with really carefully crafted language that does not deliver. And it actually feels now like the whole system is set up on doing the minimum possible, on seeing what countries can get away with. So there's a real challenge and there's a real dynamic that's developed over the years in COP, and that has not changed. Instead of feeling like we're on a race to zero carbon, it feels like we're pulling apart the document and undermining many of the crucial decisions that are essential. And again, as Mary Robinson said earlier, we need to be on an emergency footing for the planet now. But there's definitely no sense within the inside negotiations that emergency footing is happening. But I have to say that there is another COP that's going on, and I have to say that I have found this COP much more interesting, and it's what's been happening on the outside. So the formal negotiations have gone on, but what's happened on the outside has really filled me with so much hope, and I call it the People's COP. I've attended so many great events, had so many wonderful conversations, honest conversations, engaged in protests. And it feels like the truth of the situation sits outside what's happening in the COP. It sits with the people, with the faiths. I followed this past 2 weeks what the faith communities are doing, and had, from the amazing discussions on faith and finance and the alignment of faith values to investments and divestment, discussions on loss and damage, prayer services, and then last night a fantastic event in the New York Times Climate Hub on the Laudato Si movie that is coming out next year. It really feels to me that people of faith and people of goodwill are rising up in a way that I haven't experienced before at previous COPs. And I think this really gives me great courage, because I think people were concerned that after COVID, the energy of Fridays for Future and the climate movement would have dissipated, but the opposite has happened. The two massive marches and the Global Day of Action. I think what I'm challenged with at the moment is the fact that it feels so disconnected. Never before have I felt such a disconnect between what's happening on the inside and inside the COP and what's happening on the outside and what the people are saying.
Thank you. I'd certainly echo that. I was in the blue zone each day last week, and it was quite a different feeling from anything in the green zone or what you could see on the street and those wonderful demonstrations by the young activists. It didn't seem to be connecting up at all. But thank you very much. It's very informative, important as we approach the biodiversity COP15 in Kunming in China next year. Now, thank you, Dr. Lorna. We'll now turn to Dr. Carmody, if I may. And your first question, Dr. Carmody, Laudato Si awakened many Catholics to the importance of caring for creation, and set us on a new journey of awareness and action. Has it set us on a new theological journey as well, in terms of how we understand our faith?
Thank you very much, Bishop John, for the question, and greetings to you all. It's really wonderful to be here. Undoubtedly, the answer is yes. I was teaching about Laudato Si only this morning in a university in Switzerland, as I have done ever since the document came out, and I never get tired of pointing out what a revolution this document is in the history of Catholic social thought. But at the same time, it's revolutionary precisely by drawing out what in particular the scriptures have always said, but which we tend to draw back from or tend to get used to and to not see. So I'm going to try to summarize the theological journey that it points out with two themes. The first is really about the setting or the canvas, right? The scale of Christian faith and the way that the shape of our imagination of our faith. So Laudato Si draws our attention to the fact that the whole of creation is and always has been in Christ, that there isn't any outside of the scope of the work of Christ. So it's a restoration of the cosmic scale of the Christian claim, of Christian work, of Christian concern. A reminder to Christians that they must be concerned with absolutely everything that God has made. There is no outside of that concern, that Christ is the Alpha and the Omega of all things. It's a cosmic faith. It's not a local faith. It's about the actual whole scope and scale and sweep of existence itself. And Laudato Si tells this beautiful story of cosmic origins to cosmic ends as a story of being created in Christ, redeemed in Christ, and transfigured and consummated in Christ. To draw attention to one particular bit of that I think is very significant, and maybe the respect in which Laudato Si can be said to go deeper into the scriptural witness than perhaps previous teaching did, is in respect to the status of non-human life. There's a very clear claim in Laudato Si that we need to respect non-human life as having an eternal destiny in Christ, that there isn't none of creation is thrown away, if you like. None of it is about is dispensable. It's all cared for and loved by God and is destined for transformation in Christ. That's a very, very strong claim, which could have very significant implications for the way that we as Christians and Catholics relate to non-human life. A way of framing, I think, that the theological remarkableness of this document is by putting it against the background of the Second Vatican Council. In Gaudium et Spes, the Council said, in the Incarnation, the Son of God united himself definitively with every human being in some fashion. Pope Francis sort of picks up that extraordinary claim, which was a sort of high point of a Christian humanism, picks up that extraordinary claim, but this time Pope Francis says, in the Incarnation, the Son of God in some way united himself definitively with our earth, right? There's a kind of even deeper sense of the Incarnation going down to the very roots of the material world, and belonging, God's love and God's care belongs to every single particle of that world. So yes, a profound and extraordinary theological invitation to theological reframing, which I think is wholly scriptural and not in that sense new, but of course the scriptures are always new and always need to be rediscovered anew. One final and very brief point about this: it's not only a new theological journey. I think it's a new moral journey. It's a new language of if you like, moral theology or moral psychology. And of course, the key of that is this language of ecological sin and ecological conversion. That seems to me a very decisive invitation for us to reconsider the life of holiness as being an ecological one, as needing to be considered in an ecological setting and an ecological dimension, and to consider that actually every time we relate to nature, we are always also relating to other human beings, that there aren't two compartments of virtue or two compartments of moral responsibility. There's just one. There's a union of the social and the ecological, and we really can't separate them. So I think that's another important invitation that the document gives us.
Thank you. It certainly is a remarkable document, and we all deserve, we need to study it and discover it for ourselves. Now, there are lots of biblical precedents for hope in the midst of lament. So as a theologian, how would you describe our context now? And what song should the church be singing?
That's a tough question. I think every one of us needs to go back to Laudato Si, and every one of us needs to go back to the scriptures to rediscover the springs of hope. It is absolutely essential that the church sing a song of hope at this time. One of the things that I think has become clear in recent climate conversations is that narratives of hopelessness don't inspire action. Narratives of hopelessness actually instill fatigue and cynicism. That hope is a spring of action, and the church is a sort of specialist in hope. The church knows from the history of the church and from the scriptures the way in which hope constantly springs anew, even in the face of despair and even in the face of complete darkness. And of course, our faith is actually founded on such a moment. And I think we need to tell that story. We need to never get tired of telling that story in a way which applies it to our present moment. And by that story, of course, I mean the story of the ultimate facing of hopelessness, which is the life of Jesus and the death of Jesus, and then ultimately the resurrection of Jesus. But also to identify and recover stories of Christians that are appropriate and fitting for our own communities, who have done that concretely in their own lives, who have lived lives of radical hope in the face of seemingly hopeless situations. And I'm thinking in particular of some of the recent terrible killings of religious in various parts of the world. I'm thinking particularly of the Amazon, who were quite plainly murdered for their refusal to go along with the destruction of indigenous peoples and the environments that they live in, the natural environments that they live in. Those are extraordinary, inspiring stories. We need to tell them. We need to tell them more loudly. We need to remind ourselves of times in the past when whole sweeps of social history seem to be going in one direction, and one or two extraordinary visionary people stood up and said, we just can't do that anymore. Someone like Bartolomé de las Casas, who saw that the indigenous peoples of the Americas were also called to a life in Christ on an equal footing with everybody else. And he was a lone voice for a long time. And we need those stories to remind us that things can change and things do change. Final word about this. What Dr. Lorna Gold has just been saying is so shocking about the failure of leadership that we're currently witnessing. And at this time, I think what I would want to hear from the church and from the churches is an absolute refusal to settle for that. For the church to be at the absolute forefront of saying, no, that isn't good enough. Christians have such a long tradition of speaking truth to power. The faith is founded on such a moment of Christ facing Pilate. And we need every Christian, every Catholic, every church community to stand up and be counted in saying, no, it is not good enough. This failure is not okay. We will not live with this, and to not lie down to it. And to do that in a Christian manner, right? With a non-violent witness to hope, and a non-violent witness to the call to something better, to something fuller, to something more demanding, but to just not give up, right? We cannot lie down to this. And if the COP ends in the way that it seems to be, every single Christian community needs to say, we will not accept this. And I would like to hear the Catholic Church be absolutely front and center. I would like to hear the Catholic Church and the Christian churches not joining the table late and saying, oh, it'd be really nice if we could try and do better than this, but to say, absolutely not. That's the song I would like to hear the church sing.
Thank you so much, Dr. Carmody. I think the encyclical Laudato Si it really is a call to action for everyone to come together to protect our common home. And I think we all need to recognize, and every one of us has our part to play, as Pope Francis says so forcefully. We now move on to Dr. Franziska Colt from Equipping Christian Leadership in an Age of Science. Very welcome, Dr. Franziska. So may I ask you, you're an expert in science communication. What do you think are important things to look out for in media narratives about the climate crisis?
I think we've already heard quite a few bits about the importance of storytelling in both Lorna's and Carmody's contributions just now. And and the way in which I would like to structure my response is that there are some obviously unhelpful narratives out there. We've just heard about the narratives of hopelessness that drag you down, that don't really give you any ways out and nothing to do. You just feel despair. That is one that we very frequently encounter. But I want to reflect on the very obviously unhelpful narratives that we encounter in the media, but also the ones that we might perhaps ourselves often unwittingly repeat ourselves. So when we talk about the climate crisis, we very often feel a sense of exhaustion or despair. We hear it so often. We feel we're exhausted, and that has a lot to do with the media coverage of it. We very often, and I think that's even worse, perceive the climate crisis as something that's polarizing, that we perhaps even don't want to talk about anymore because it's so explosive that we're going to end up in an argument every single time we bring it up, and we perceive it as a polarized debate because it is as often portrayed as such in media narratives. It is perpetuated. It's instigated. We heard a little bit about the lobbying and the interventions, the deliberately polarizing interventions from those who do not have an interest in resolving the crisis, this climate crisis that we're all facing. We see this deliberate intervention, but this can also be perpetuated in the media or perhaps amplified by lots of things that we often don't pick up. We're facing the extraordinary situation, which there's a scientific consensus. There's not really an argument whether man-made climate change is happening or not. And yet we very often, when we switch on the news, see arguments between climate deniers, climate change deniers or skeptics, and on the other side, despairing scientists trying to make a point. And we often see this as a split screen, a 50-50 screen, as if there is a 50-50 representations of these opinions, which is something that sort of subliminally polarizes this debate, which is often very unhelpful. And our debates are being manipulated by this in a way that we very often, when we want to sing the song, when we want to bring up this conversation, when we want to instigate conversations in our own communities, we feel we fail because we are being pushed into this polarized discussion, which shouldn't be a polarized discussion. And we feel pushed into a corner where we're having to justify this, and we're feeling trapped in a narrative that we need to step out of very consciously. The second point I wanted to make was that we very often unknowingly become influenced in a way in which we perceive this crisis. And I found it very, very telling that Lorna just at the start said, we cannot ignore this crisis anymore. It is at our doorstep. It concerns all of us. The climate crisis, the biodiversity crisis are one crisis, and it is here. We can no longer ignore it. And yet, when we see videos and when we see news coverage of the climate crisis, we still see glaciers and polar bears. We still see regions that are not ours. We see flora and fauna that is not ours. And in my previous work, I've worked a lot with insects, with biodiversity crises in worlds that we very often do not see. And I can tell you the biodiversity crisis is very much here. It is very much here, and yet it is not the way in which it is portrayed. And so we can trick and fool ourselves, and the media can trick and fool us into a false sense of comfort that it somehow doesn't concern us, that it isn't yet here, it doesn't yet concern us. And yet we see these videos and we think, oh yes, that's terrible and I'm scared. And yet we can remain in the comfort of that it somehow doesn't concern us. And that this is something we're exposed to every day that we don't have the words for. And so my work in science communication is very much to raise awareness of this, that this is a thing that does surround us. And once we can read this, once we can read the science, we can do something about changing this conversation. We can change the narratives ourselves. And I want to enable people to have the tools to recognize this and to be able to also have the tools to intervene in more positive ways in this conversation.
Thank you. I wonder if we can follow up and you could suggest some helpful alternatives to current narratives that may encourage action and hope.
Yes, and I think this is in a way I'm going to start basically the wrong way around. I'm going to start at the bottom here when I was talking about the showing of polar bears and so on as being an unhelpful thing perhaps to engage with climate change. One of the things that the Laudato Si encyclical, that Pope Francis's communication, has been one of the reasons this has been so powerful for people all around the world, and especially also people outside the Catholic Church, is that it really brought it home to us. It made it our issue. It is so, and it also made us feel like we could do something about it. Not only that we have to, but that we could. It enabled us, and I think those two things are one of the things that we can, two of the things that we can work with: bring it home and empower. Something we can all do in our own lives and our own communication. This is something the Catholic Church is a very, very good place to start with, because it's a community made out of people who work in very different walks of life, and who can all take what they encounter in the Catholic Church to where they are. And this is important in a climate in which we feel overwhelmed, in which we feel hopeless, in which we feel this is all too big, it's all underway, it cannot be stopped. Starting from the bottom with us, it's really important. So instead of showing polar bears in our communities, in our sermons, in our community acts, in our community communication, in our own workplaces about climate change, start with something that happens at your home. Do a quick Google search. You won't have any trouble finding how the climate crisis and how the biodiversity crisis affects where you are. The Catholic Church has a community, it has premises, it has communities and consisting of individuals who will be able not only to recognize this as something that happens around them, but also something they can tackle at home. We can tackle biodiversity decline, coming back to the example of insects, and the way we plant and rewild our own communities. This is something very practical that we can do. This is something we can take back into our workplaces. And this is something that ties into a greater overarching narrative. And this is not the one of polarization and division. Narratives of hope are often tied to narratives of wonder, of rediscovery. All of these wonderful close-ups in the video that we saw just early on are things that make us look at the environment, the nature, the world around us, creation through new eyes. We magnify things. We really take the time to study these things. We recognize things that we have not seen in this light, and we're willing to learn about them. These are narratives that most often are encountered in the nursery, in children's books, and yet here we are all children of God. And we should all engage with nature and learn to engage with nature through this sense of wonder, be willing to learn and rediscover and see things in a new light. And through that, create our own narratives of hope that concern us, that touch us, and are relevant to all of us and every single one of us.
Thank you very much, Dr. Francisca. It's clear, isn't it, that climate change narratives need to be very relatable, and a clarion call for all of us to work to protect the earth. Now we move on to climate finance. We have Lydia Machaca from SIDSI here. Very welcome, Lydia. Can I ask you, please, this is a bit of a long question, but bear with me. Net zero pledges mean nothing without fossil fuel divestment. It's even worse when the climate finance to help mitigate and adapt to climate change comes with stipulations that make access even harder. Time and again, we have seen a wealth of loopholes and opportunities for backsliding that we cannot afford if we are to avoid climate breakdown. Is there a strategy to seal these loopholes? And what are the deliverables you want to see for COP26 on this?
Thank you very much for inviting me, and welcome to our audience tonight. As I'm actually speaking with you tonight, I'm speaking from the convention in the Blue Zone. And I would really love to provide my feedback in this manner. I think actually you rightfully said that net zero pledges mean nothing without fossil fuel divestment. I think you have captured the question quite correctly, because so far some of the problems we have with net zero pledges is that very often there is a focus on reducing carbon emissions from the atmospheres rather than actually reducing fossil fuels or emissions. So this is why it is very important for fossil fuels divestment going forward. I wanted to say that coming to COP right at the beginning, I remember there were quite a lot of political statements that were made at the beginning. So far, with the new draft decision that we have received early this morning, we recognize that there is an imbalance between those beautiful political and technical intervention here at COP. For example, at the beginning, we heard a lot of politicians recognizing the need to end fossil fuels by the end of the decade. And actually, I wanted to say, according to the latest draft text, we were pleased to see at least a mention of the need to phase out fossil fuels. However, what is still really, really disheartening from our side is that there is no clear timeline to end this fossil fuel. So it might be recognized, but then we're not even sure when this would be done. And since this is a first draft of the decision or the COP26 decision, we just hope that the politicians will be able to keep this this recognition in the text, because there's going to be several iterations of this draft decision. But we were just interested to see it in the draft decision, but would like to see that there is clear timelines for cutting that. Of course, there are various indications coming from civil society that this should happen as soon as 2030. Others talking about the need to end fossil fuel subsidies as early as 2022. I wanted to highlight that parties do have the existing commitment for the need to provide 100 billion climate finance annually by 2020. But I wanted to, in order to keep, let me say, everyone under the 1.5 degrees target, but so far parties have not been able to meet their 2020 target. And it is what we also think at this present moment to encourage parties to meet their 2020 target, but also to go beyond 2025 and beyond, because we understand that right now many developing countries, actually everybody around the world, are struggling with adapting to climate change, but also recognizing with the latest IPCC report that the many communities will experience continuing and rapid extreme weather events. So we believe that parties should be able to indicate a strong commitment to provide long-term finance beyond 2025. I wanted to indicate also recently that SITSE has published a report lately on climate finance, really the aim to improve civil society's access to the Green Climate Fund. And we also had a side event here, the Green Zone. We had an opportunity to have a representative from the Green Climate Fund. We do recognize that small-scale organizations or even farmers on the ground are still struggling to access finance, climate finance, particularly under the Green Climate Fund. And what we propose actually is that access to the Green Climate Fund should be made easier, and actually the finance should be predictable over time, and that the finance should also be new and additional. This is something that we also thought, since most of the agencies or institutions that are receiving finance are government and huge UN agencies, it would be good that as much as there is a specific finance facility for businesses in order to meet their climate targets or plans, it would actually be useful for a similar finance facility to be made for a small organization on the ground. So really, there are discussions around really enhancing direct access to the GCF, but this is not yet heard. For now, it's still recommendations, but for us, it would be very much interesting if we see this proposal materializing in the coming years.
Okay, if I can just bring it down to, can you see some financing commitments and pledges coming out of COP26 which address damage and loss? And do you think that any of these commitments are enough?
Yes, thank you for that question. I think actually for those who might not be aware of the topic of loss and damage, it really represents all the irreversible climate impacts that are not able, let me say, to be covered after mitigation or adaptation has taken place. And quite frankly, the topic on loss and damage has been previously ignored in previous conversations. Of course, it's a topic of discussions, but we have not been able to see at least mechanisms being put in place to really show the significance and the determination of developed nations in making sure that this aspect is addressed. But we have heard actually even at the beginning of COP26, politicians recognizing the need for addressing loss and damage. We saw that even in the latest draft decision that there is that recognition. Over and above that, it was also interesting to see Scotland, whose pledge about 1 million from its climate justice fund to communities who are experiencing climate impacts. And I think this is a good start. And for many, anyone would arguably say that 1 million would be insufficient to cover. I think there are quite a lot of reports that really indicate like figures around, I think up to about 500 trillion to really address the actual cost of losses and damages. But this is a good step coming from Scotland, and they have set precedents for other richer nations to follow. And it would be very, very interesting, and we would really appreciate it if other countries follow suit, but also within the United Nations framework, that finance for loss and damage is recognized and is also, let me say, within the UNFCCC, there are clear channels on how other countries could channel their finance and mobilize it to countries who are in need.
Okay, thank you. And finally, how can we as Catholics follow up to make sure that these commitments are being implemented? How can Catholics be part of the solution?
All right, thank you. I mean, really, COP26 really indicate 26 years of negotiations and really trying to urge and inspire governments to really commit and to addressing climate change effectively. I mean, one of the things that I can encourage Catholic actors, especially recognizing our role to maintain the moral compass. I think earlier on our speakers really rightfully said about the need to stand our ground and speak truth to power, indicating the need to address climate change, but more specifically, everyone from their unique country have the responsibility to hold their governments accountable for all the promises that we are seeing today. Because I notice, and many would also agree, that many countries are still blame shifting, or maybe, let me say, set their action dependent on what others countries do. So I think I would encourage Catholic actors to remind their governments in really fulfilling their God-given responsibilities, because really COP26 is one of the many COPs. I hope actually we don't need more COPs, but just looking at the fact that next year there will be COP27 in Africa, we really hope that individuals would be able to speak with their governments and apply the necessary pressure to really deliver on their promises. I also wanted to highlight once again, I know that this we often talk, especially looking at activities around the Laudato Si. I know young people, women, indigenous groups really can play a key role in living by example and continuing to do so, because especially I just wanted to highlight example living sustainably. Even other speakers talked about ethical investments or investing in clean technologies or redirecting our investments from banks that support fossil fuels. Those are the kind of supports that, whether it is a church, an institution, or an individual, by really being conscious about the type of decisions we make every day. Simple, small steps, I believe, could lead in the right direction. And understanding that, I think sometimes we forget that our activities that we continue to do, sometimes it seems like when somebody look at their effort as an individual, it seems significant. But when you look at the broader picture, how connected you are, and realizing the power of the masses, I believe really would go forward. And I think for me, it's that message of hope that was talked about earlier on, realizing that, yes, of course, we're looking for solutions outside, maybe from our political leaders, but also at the same time, looking within us, looking at ourselves as the hope, and talking about the sustainable change that we need, beginning with us.
Thank you very much, Lydia. I think it's plain, isn't it, that the solution depends on all of us taking our part, and we've all got a voice, and we can all take actions that may seem to be minimal individually, but they add up to so much, and we need to be speaking as a church and as a community, a family of the church. So thank you very much for that. And finally, but not definitely not least, I turn to Father Eduardo Scarel and ask you, Father Eduardo, could you kindly share with us what integral ecology means and why, as people of faith, we need to exercise it?
John, can you hear me? Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Good evening, everybody. I'm very happy to be with you and share. I also thank you for delivering the questions beforehand, because I could prepare some notes. As you have realized, English is not my mother tongue, so I will have some struggling in expressing myself. So I will try to follow my notes without being so attached to them, but just to make myself understood by all of you. And thank you again for this kind invitation. First of all, integral ecology that is offered to all of the Christians by Pope Francis in Laudato Si must be considered a paradigm, a worldview, or a cosmovision of the relationship of human beings to the earth, to God, and to all reality. And integral ecology is based on the sacred scriptures of Christians. In the scripture, in the Bible, we see that in the creation, everything is interconnected, and beings are also linked to the sacred dimension, which is God the Creator. We human beings need worldviews to develop our culture, our social patterns of living together, in order to understand what we expect and what others expect from me. In this integrative view, what happens to the earth or to my brother and my sister happens also to me, happens to God, because everything is interconnected. Probably the most precious deliver that Pope Francis gives in the Laudato Si encyclical is that integral ecology is not only scientifically based, because that is really a teaching from science. If we remember the theory of chaos that Edward Lorenz, a meteorologist in 1963, developed, we already knew that the butterfly the wings of a butterfly in Texas could provoke a tornado in Brazil, for instance. That is the interconnection that science reveals to humanness, to humanity. But also Pope Francis looks for the hidden dimension of this integration, that is also the sacred dimension of reality. Therefore, we must understand integral ecology as the way to be really Christians today. If you are a believer, if you believe in the resurrection, you have to work for the care of the earth, for the social and environmental justice as well. There is no way to be a believer than by striving to heal human being relationship with the environment, with each other, and with the sacred presence at the same time. In the 60s, after Vatican II, we learned, especially the theologians and the communities of faith, to read the signs of the times. That is, to grasp the controversial messages embedded in the social, cultural, and political events that history offers. But integral ecology also reveals that we have to look at the signs of the place, which means to perceive the signs of sin and ruptures present in the local geography, in the natural environment that sustains the neighborhood, the town, the city, the country, or the earth itself. Thanks to the contribution of science, this planet can be regarded today as ever in our history a common home, which is the only one inhabited by the human family in a diversity of peoples. That's why that river, that mountain, the coast, the forests, the valley, the glacier are not mere natural elements scattered around with no implications in our lives, but emerge as the support, the solid base, the configuring structure, which make possible the global oikos, the common home. That's why, in this way, I understand that the natural environment previously was seen as a mere static and immutable scenario in which human history unfolded, but now must be perceived as a theological place for us all. This is because the environment is the support, possibility, and limit of life in its broadest sense and unfolding in time and space. With its specific concrete qualities, the inhabited environment can facilitate life, conditions it, and limits. Therefore, the environment also shapes the relationship between men and women of all times and their environment reciprocally. And that environment today is climate. That environment today is the glaciers, the ice caps in the poles, and they are really speaking to us. From an ecological point of view, the environment is in fact the physical concrete space of nature at a given time, in which the exchange of energy in all its form takes place. And that flow of energy in the Earth system is a complete gift of the sun. Life flows from the sun daily and is received by the environment. Nothing of human intervention can be added to spontaneously, naturally unfold the magnificent gift of possibilities that the solar energy brings with it. And the life that sprinkled from this physical and concrete space is really a miracle in all its forms, in mutual interrelationship with the environment. And that's why we need to look for solutions in the sense of the way we relate with each other, with nature, with God, from reading the signs of the place. And climate change, it's like the paradigm, the umbrella in which the cry of the poor and the cry of the earth can be heard now worldwide and must be also thought theologically. The church, we as communities of faith, need to dig in our tradition, in our spirituality, in order to look for ways to reconcile our relationships, in order to recover our harmony with the Creator, with nature, and with one another. And that is integral ecology. It's a manner in which we relate, and it's conversion of mind as well. We need to make a click in our understanding, the way that human beings relate with God, with nature. So far, we've been doing so only from dominion presence. We were wearing the glasses of dominion that is also accounted in the Bible, in the book of Genesis. And we need to change the glasses in order to view the world, to view our relationship with the glasses of reciprocity, of being part of the earth. We are also members. We are made of earth. We are part of this big family, living in a common home. I hope that I was clear enough to you all.
You've done very well. Thank you, Father Eduardo. If I can just quote from your article, where you say, quote, "The profound environmental crisis is altering the internal balances of the planet that once provided societies with specific stationary and normalizing frameworks for the unfolding of social, cultural, political, and economic events." That's the end of that quote. I just wonder if I could ask you finally what your feeling is about COP26 and how can we amplify that sense of integral ecology in the world?
Well, thank you. My feelings are mixed for this COP26. I really agree with all the impressions that my colleagues before have shared to you all. In one hand, I'm excited. I was excited. I've been with you in Glasgow during the first week. Now I'm back in Spain. I have expectation that we can achieve the necessary transformation that is required to address the problems associated with the anthropogenic emission of greenhouse gases that are really changing the Earth climate. However, on the other hand, I realize that the political, economic, and financial process to achieve these necessary changes will take a long time. It's taking a long time. So this fight for climate actions is a long one. The ambitions, the NCDs presented by the countries is an example of the complexity and the slowness, as many have already quoted this, and some of our colleagues also have mentioned. I think it was Lydia or Lona. They are insufficient. The ambitions of our country really are short of hand. From the happy moment of the Paris Agreement 6 years ago, have passed a lot of water under the bridge, and we are still in the same place in terms of climate action. And 2030 is not far away. I think it may be impossible in practical terms to achieve the drastic transformation of the energy matrix that is driving the world's economies due to a lack of agreement, as we've been read this afternoon from the draft document. Also a lack of investment, financing, and even technological problems that in order to detach our economies based on carbon dioxide. My fear is that alternative energies, given that they are still expensive, will be only for a few, and that aid to the other poorer nations, which even today need help to be able to develop their societies with dignity, will be postponed. Some of this has happened with the unfair distribution of the pandemic vaccination, for instance, that we have learned in these 2 years. In addition, I would like to emphasize the following from a scientific point of view of science of climate. Science provides a frame of reference for decision making. Many people are discussing, arguing from science. The limits that are suggested from action should not be taken as blanket statements that if we do not manage to reduce the CO2 emissions to 50% of what we have emitted in 2010 by 2030, and we do not succeed in reaching net zero emission by 2050 and reaching a warming below 2 degrees Celsius by the end of this century, then the cataclysm, the apocalypse is coming. That is not going to happen because nature is benevolent and will have adaptation with mechanisms internals that the nature provides, and probably the problems that arise will force us to rethink things in order to adapt and survive ourselves. In other words, climate science does not predict an apocalyptic future, nor does it indicate that we should leave things as they are. I'm not saying that. The real and concrete future is in God's hands, in that He has given us intelligence and responsiveness and a wonderful earth with its internal laws and dynamics worthy of living on. In fact, I tell you this, even if we achieve the necessary CO2 reductions in the coming decades, the effects on climate change that we are causing already and will cause in the coming years will last for a long time in the atmosphere, let's say 100 years at least. And therefore, the benefits will not be immediate. By this, I mean that science tells us that we need to change the direction of our cultures of overconsumption, of predatory economies, and the way we think about progress, so that integral human development is more in harmony with and respectful of the resilience of the earth. These behavioral changes are primarily human and social, and are likely to take a long time. We must not stop working towards them. This is the new Laudato Si culture that we want to share, and we are doing so now. Therefore, integral ecology means that we are looking for ways to develop a different perception of reality, of relationship among others. The struggle or the fight at this COP26 is, and in the many more to come in the future, is about achieving profound changes for future generations. We are looking to save the planet, the common home, not for us, but for those who are coming in the future. Especially for what may happen because of current actions, current ways of emitting carbon dioxide within 50, 100, 200, or 300 years ahead. For instance, the Antarctic melting that will probably happen by the end of the century will provoke really big changes within 300 years. Today, it is about climate change, our fight. In the future, it will be about other worldview transformations that are necessary to live in harmony. If we continue the current global madness of unsustainable development based on the mere accumulation and voracious squandering of the Earth's goods, we will succumb as a civilization in that time frame because we do not feel that we are part of the Earth and that we are Earth as well. With this, what I mean, that there's no, we don't have to, as we've been saying before, lose the hope, in the sense that probably the outcome of this COP26 is going to be discouraging. It's not we are hoping, but we have not to see that if we are not reaching the goal of the reduction by 2030, we still have time, in the sense that we can arrange the agenda of our nations, because really it's a complex process. But let's speak about 2040, 2050. If we are in the process of working together, nations, business, communities of faith, and also the politics, working together in order to reshape the energy matrix, especially we don't have to forget the loss of biodiversity We are destroying also the ecosystems. It's not only the carbon dioxide emissions, though all the discussion is now focused on a reduction of the CO2 emissions and the carbon market. But beyond that, we also need to continue working for changing the mind, changing our cosmovision, and that's a long process. And if we are right, because this could be probably from I've been working in climate science over the last 20 years. I've been in the last 12 years participating at COPs, and what I see is certainly the process is taking too slow according to our expectations, our anxiety. But the science, even though we are providing numbers like 1-2 degrees Celsius of warming, etc., it's not like a switch in, switch off system. It's a chaotic, indeterministic system. So these are like limits, broader limits that the important thing is that we are oriented towards the good end. When it will happen, we don't know. In the meantime, we have to change, we have to reduce, we have to clean our energies, we have to look for alternatives. Clearly, we have to invest, our nation has to invest their revenues in clean energies in the future. There is no doubt of that. But also we must be aware that if we do not change the internal interests that human and societies have, we are only just changing the plate of consumption. Instead of burning fossil fuels, the next we are going to burn nuclear power, for instance, and because the issue is not now it's carbon dioxide, but within 100 years, if we do not change our cosmovision, our relationship with nature and with one another, the problem will be another one, because the thing that we have to fix is the human heart, the inside, the spirituality, the way we connect and we prosper and flourish oneself in this planet. And saying this, and just I will finish, for sure we may arrive by 2030 without really fixing the problem of carbon dioxide reduction, because that is the horizon. But even that, if that happens, we do not must lose our hope, because we have to continue looking for the change of paradigm, and in order to resolve the problem of climate change, and not be afraid that there's going to be a catastrophe. Because I heard when I was in the COP26, I heard some side events or comments or some kind of exasperation by the people that we are going into the cataclysm by the end of the century. Don't be afraid that way. We need to be hopeful and with expectation that we're going to change for good. Thank you, and sorry for my long speech.
Thank you very much, Father Eduardo, and thank you to all our speakers, because I think we come away with a broad sense of what COP is about, what it needs to be about. We've got a sense of hope as Christians, certainly, but we've also got that sense of urgency and that sense also of our own responsibility, each and every one of us in our faith. And one thing I'd simply like to say is that one thing that was very evident to me last week when I was at COP was that sense of unity among the different world faiths, that I heard so many different faiths praying, and I couldn't disagree with a single comment that they were making, because it was all very much with the sense of priority of care for our common home, which is common to all of us. So we come to the end of that first session. Thank you very much to the speakers. I'd now like to ask for questions so that we can move on. And if you've got a question, please, if you'd like to put it into the dialogue, and we'll see what we can get through in the next 45 minutes or so. Have we got a question? At the moment, we're all thinking.
There's lots of questions there in the chat already.
All right.
If you go to the private chat if you scroll down, maybe we could jump in. There's some really interesting questions there.
Yeah, I can't actually see those. So can someone, one of the speaker, Lorna, are you able to?
Yeah, I mean, I can start. There's a great question there about fossil fuel industry. And in fact, there's two questions there about fossil fuels and renewable energy. So I'm happy to. Okay, I'll start with that one. So I think the question is really whether the fossil fuel industry are really there in the COP to lobby for renewable energy. And I think we have to really recognise what the fossil fuel industry are at and see it in the bigger picture of the way in which fossil fuel companies are really in the business of delaying change, of prospecting for more oil and gas, now moving into actively pursuing licenses to drill in the Arctic Circle, which is just beyond belief at this stage. And you have to look really at what the kind of investments that they are making in renewable energy. So according to reports by the Carbon Tracker, it's around 5%. The most that any of the big companies is putting into renewables is 5% of their overall investments. So you have to ask, looking at all of this, whether these are trusted actors in this space. And I have to say no. There's no business of the fossil fuel industry, of the industry that is bringing the world to the brink of destruction. Of course, has done much good in terms of the economic development and the what that's enabled in terms of society over the Industrial Revolution. But we're moving out now of the fossil fuel industry into a new era. And this industry is really actively engaging in greenwashing, in manipulation, almost, I would say at this stage, in gaslighting, confusing the public to the point that nobody quite knows where we stand. Somebody on a different panel I was on during the day said, the transition we are, at the time, if you think about the way that the tobacco industry became a pariah in the 1980s and 90s, when the damage was known, and yet there was a point where they continued to delay the inevitable changes that were coming, and to kind of not greenwash, but to dress up and to minimize the impact. We're facing in a much more serious level the same effect with the fossil fuel industry. So, I mean, I would say we need to be really super conscious. This is an industry which is really using it's like in its dying, it's not quite in its dying breath. One final thing to say about that is that those who've studied energy transitions in the past, and the industry know this fine well, like from horse and cart to the motor car to the combustible engine, all the big transitions, there were winners and losers. And almost universally, the winners in the next energy transition were not the ones who were dominant in the previous transition, in the previous era, because they were relying on a completely different technology. The ones who had horse and carts did not make the best motor cars. So the fossil fuel industry is saddled with infrastructure now that is defunct if we meet the Paris Agreement, is saddled with assets that are stranded. So why would you invest in those companies to make the transition to clean energy? So I think we can't trust that industry at this present time.
And I think there's one important point to really draw out, if I may, in Lorna's contribution just now, and that's the one. There's on the one hand side, the ecological damage. That's very, very clear and very apparent to see. We can number this, we can show images, we can show the data, we know where the extraction is happening, and so on. But there's also the slightly, and you say, I find it interesting you use the term gaslighting, because that's what's happening. On the one hand side, we were just both talking about the interventions in terms of narrative and greenwashing here, and it's the really interesting stuff that on the one hand side, a lot of these companies are making it sound to individual consumers that if you consume more of their products, you're somehow going to use less and make everything better, which is obviously not what it happens. And so this is why there's two sides to this. There's on the one hand side the education about the facts that are out there, what damage this is doing, but on the other hand, there's also the literacy, the media literacy, what narratives are out there. When we hear these sort of terms that sound great in practice, what is actually beneath this? And we need to teach at every single stage how we see through these narratives, how we can pull the mask of greenwashing off this. And this is why this activism is so important, because we talked about the duty to speak truth to power. That's what we need to do. We need to learn the mechanics, not only of the extraction, but also of the deception on the other side. So there's two very, very important things that Lorna has just highlighted.
Thank you. I see in the comments, we've got quite a number of comments about how we promote an understanding of what we need to be doing, and mention of bishops and priests and parishes. I think probably we could all comment on that to a degree, could we? If I might start, I think in my experience within the diocese is in the schools, quite extraordinary enthusiasm for the environment, not in a frightening sort of way, but particularly in the primary schools, children really interested in finding out about the environment. They take that home, and they can be an influence there. And I think that we've got a wonderful, dare I say, possibility for evangelizing here. We're all often talking about young people not being interested in church and being pretty well turned off, but they are so enthusiastic about the environment that if we can show that the church has a real interest and priority and sense of urgency, that it is our common home, our brothers and sisters, then this is a way I feel sure we can engage young people in that sense of faith being in the environment too. And that we've got to be talking about the environment. And I don't suppose it's much good a priest getting up in the pulpit and talking about global warming and climate change in that global sense. We need to be able to talk about it in our day-to-day, the way we do things, you know, our waste, plastic waste, recycling, the way we eat, buying local produce when we're traveling, the sorts of things that we do each and every day that can be effective. They may seem to be minimal, but they add up to a very substantial contribution. But anyway, over to anyone else who wants to comment on that.
I would like to just to add to your sharing, Father John. Now here at the moment I'm in our school and our high school, and I do agree that the young people, they are really very interested in learning on the care for environment, especially learning, understanding climate change. We are just starting here in the school a program of climate literacy, we are calling that, with different teachers of geography, physics and chemistry and natural science, and also religion. And it's important also to offer an integral narrative with all the sciences that we teach at high school, in order to learn that we can do something in favor of caring for our climate, for the earth in general. And I also agree that it's sometimes for those who priests or religious people who are engaged in justice and peace and integrity of creation. It's simple to combine the Bible, the gospel with this sensitivity that we have on ecological issues, but it's not common in general in our dioceses for the rest. So a work that we especially probably, and this is a challenge that I offer to the Laudato Si movement, we may develop a program or a strategy in order to address and facilitate the preaching of the gospel through values of the care of environment, the care of creation, climate crisis, like a climate literacy for the priests, in order to help them to share also these concerns that we are having as humans. I've got my brothers in community that usually they feel that they need to, they are not confident on these issues. That's why they do not preach and share. And it would be important if we can offer a basis where to learn. We may say, okay, certainly we've got Laudato Si, there are many other sources, but probably in a more global project or on a more integrated platform, we can offer that. I think we are trying to do that in the coming years also through the Laudato Si platforms, and we have to take advantage of that. And one thing is something that I perceived especially from the youth, that here in Spain in the last months there have been some issues on the rising prices of electricity because of adapting according to the policy, the national government adapting the strategies due to climate change policies, etc. But the message sometimes is like kind of negative, depressive. I mean, the future, if we do not do this, if we are not really fulfilling our commitments, like the Paris Agreement, the end of the civilization will come soon, and we can't transmit that to the youth. We can't preach that. We have always to offer that we are able to find solutions. We are working on that, and probably if deadlines are coming over us, no matter. It's like we can recover the process slowly after deadlines and continue doing what we are doing. I hope that you understand my strength in this, but this is because I find it's important not to lose the passion, but not being hysteric in the sense, oh, we are not reaching the 2030 targets and we are lost. No, we are not lost. We still have time. Science tells that we have time, though it's not probably the mainstream from science. When we look at if you have read, or it's available, the sixth IPCC report, you will read that there is still time. I mean, there is possibility to move a little bit, probably slower as the countries are doing, in the sense that even that we are in the good track and we are going to cope the problem soon.
I come in here just to the same question. I know there's so many other questions, but I think this is a really important one. I've got maybe 3 points I wanted to make on this. Like, what can we practically do to bring leadership around Laudato Si? The first one was exactly what Father Eduardo said there. We need to have climate literacy and a formation for leaders in the church, and obviously Laudato Si movement's doing this. There's a lot of work happening outside around Laudato Si movement. I think we really need to step this up, like with the urgency now that's required, and the sense of like kind of almost a step change in that formation for church leaders, and harnessing really the power of some of the very, very substantial educational networks that the Catholic Church has. So really build this formation for new priests, but also for other lay leaders in the church, and find the right ways to include or to develop that formation around climate science, around biodiversity. The second thing I think we need to do is to really inspire communities with really examples, what I would call them lighthouses, where communities of faith, whatever shape or form they are committing and coming up with solutions and sharing those stories. And we often hear stories of individual action, but I really believe the word that matters most in Laudato Si is the community ecological conversion. We're at a point where we can do limited amounts on our own, but as a church, we're made of communities, as Bishop John said. And finally, I think each bishop's conference needs to have a Laudato Si champion bishop. I was really moved on Saturday to see Bishop John Arnold, Bishop Martin Hayes, and Bishop Bill Nolan representing the Laudato Si or equivalent bishop for all three of the bishops' conferences can celebrate Mass before the march. And then march with us in the pouring rain, in the howling gales, up to our necks in mud, and really experience the grit that it requires to have the courage to in this struggle around climate action. I think that if every bishop's conference had a champion bishop, you could start to see. I know there's challenges there as well, but it would be, you could see the acceleration of some of the changes we need.
Thank you. Should we be moving on? Can someone spot another question in there?
Yes.
So there's a question. Oh, Lydia, you go ahead.
Yes, I think I saw a question around climate justice, how we would be able to respond to that at COP. I mean, I think everybody would really fairly right now understand the debate around climate justice, understanding that majority of those in developing countries who contributed the least to climate change are the ones who are receiving the most climate impacts as we speak. And just linking to the role of the encyclical in this whole debate, I mean, I wanted to highlight that quite strongly through the Laudato Si, is that love and care for creation are very critical and essential dimensions of our faith. And really, through the Laudato Si encyclical, I think it's also helping us to really critically reflect on two important questions, and there could be more. And I think what would be very critical at this stage is how do we love our neighbors in need by sharing wealth, and also at the same time loving our earth by promoting sustainability, and how do we promote economic growth and respect for our common good. I'd really love to still come back on the topic on climate finance, that there's quite a lot. I mean, many of us would really agree that really it's not a matter of a question that developed nations do have finances, actually are capable of providing the necessary finance needed by developing nations in meeting their climate finance, climate mitigation and adaptation goals. But I wanted to highlight that it's really a moment of allowing businesses, governments, and other institutions in really reflecting deeply in sharing. I think there's one important aspect that is we see it missing a lot: sharing wealth or sharing the economic benefits that have been received, actually coming from, historically developing nations have had the opportunity, actually have been providing natural resources, and right now it would be very supportive coming from developing nations, if they would be able to share their wealth. And it's not just a nice thing to do, but I believe all of us do recognize that it is a responsibility to developing nations.
Fran, do you want to pick up on the justice question, and then I can come in after you?
I think we have a bit of a muddle here with the questions, don't we? I think there was a question about more concrete actions we can offer, and I'm happy to come in on that, but I'm also happy to come in after you, depending on which one you want to go first. I'm happy to talk a little bit about concrete action, because that was one of the questions that's come up a lot. What can we do in our own communities? And there was also a question of offering hope without naivety. And that's a really interesting point there, because we're talking a lot about inspiring and inspiring hope, but we also talk a lot about blah, blah, blah. And we talk about greenwashing, and we say, oh, there's all of these great videos with lots of visions of hope, but how can we actually connect the sense of hope as something we can really connect to individual action that we can achieve ourselves and within our communities? I'm speaking here on behalf and as part of the ECLAS project. We bring together scientists and churches and church leaders. We bring them together as a forum in which they can talk to each other, in which they can talk about their own concerns, because one of the things that we do still encounter quite a lot, especially when we look at the Catholic Church and Catholic communities from the outside, and not just the Catholic Church, but churches in general, is that for some reason science and churches don't go together. There's something that's none of your business. How dare you speak in this? And when we bring bishops and when we bring church leaders and lay clergy into these meetings, that is a concern that we hear the most often expressed. But this is one of the things where Laudato Si, the encyclical, really changed the communication. Scientists said, yes, this is exactly it. This is exactly what we needed. So we can recreate those initiatives in our own communities. We can bring people together to sit down together to say, well, we need someone here who can explain this, who can enable someone to have the tools to talk about this. When, as clergy, as churches, as church members, we feel uncomfortable, not confident enough to speak about this, we can bring people together, we can facilitate workshops to do this. But also, one of the things that is concrete action and concrete plans and empowerment of individuals with concrete actions is a very good antidote against blah, blah, blah and naivety. They're very concrete reasons for climate change and for biodiversity crises in our own communities. I live in the city of Sheffield, where the most dominating piece of news for the past few years has been the issue of deforestation and biodiversity crisis emerging from it. You can engage your communities through what is happening locally. We have campaigned locally for the discontinuation of the use of pesticides, which are one we talk about fossil fuel a lot, but pesticides are a major issue in biodiversity crisis and on unbalancing biodiversity in our own areas. We can address these things in our own communities. And lastly, we are not alone as church communities. There will be lots of initiatives operating in our areas. We will have carbon literacy projects. Invite them to your community initiatives. Work together with them. They're already there. Join hands. We do have a voice in this, and we can give other people a voice through our platforms, through our communities. One of the most important ingredients in science communication is trust. We have an immense privilege as a church to have access to communities who trust us. This is a huge responsibility. Bringing the people to join forces, to join hands, and give the people who trust you these tools and achieve something locally, which then can be this beacon, which can be this lighthouse that Lorna is talking about, and shout it from the rooftops. This is something that we have achieved bottom up together, and that will create a movement that is already happening. So don't be shy about it.
I'll just quickly add to, thank you so much, Fran. That was awesome as a response to that. I'd like to add to the concrete steps thing and then pick up on the justice issue. And in the concrete steps category comes the issue of how we avoid naivety while still being hopeful. Right. This is one of the ways in which we need to be concrete. And by the way, I think choosing to be concrete is itself a form of resistance to naivety. Right. Naivety has a kind of airy-fairy, we'll just sort of take it as it comes kind of consequence to it. Concrete actions are a way of showing that we are hopeful but not naive. I think that there's been I agree with everything that's been said about the way in which faith communities and Christian communities can be agents of change. I'd like to add that a particular gap that I see is in churches leveraging political agency. I've never heard a pastor or a minister or a preacher say from the pulpit, if you don't write to your MP, then you're not fulfilling your Christian responsibility. I think that in a way, the language of personal ecological conversion is so powerful and so important, but it can become too important. Or rather, it can eclipse the sense in which we need to take responsibility for the politics of which we are a part. And that in different societies, that looks like different things. But if we're lucky enough to live in a democracy, then somehow we've got to find ways of churches leveraging that political power very, very directly, applying really, really persistent, kind of surgically precise political pressure, both in relation to specific issues that are facing their local communities, like the deforestation example in Sheffield. But more than that, forcing our leaders to represent humanity altogether. That seems to me really, really critical and not really taken up yet. So a few weeks ago, I attended a big meeting in Rome of the world's faith leaders who together signed an appeal to be presented at COP26. One of the things that's a staggering fact is that 86% of the world belongs to a faith community. That is such an enormous constituency of humanity. And if those faiths were to speak with one voice, which is what they did in that document, that's an enormous power. It's an enormous kind of moral majority, if you like. And one thing that churches can do is to work, look to work more concretely with other faith communities around them and to speak with one voice, precisely in that political regard, precisely to increase their profile. That sounds like a sort of, some kind of political maneuvering going on. But actually, this is a time to be strategic. And I think that sometimes the language of personal conversion and indeed the language of, as it were, personal piety can distract from that. This is a time when strategic coordinated action is absolutely essential. And faith communities have a real capacity to do that together. And I think it's an untapped capacity and to apply that collective pressure at the highest level. In that regard, what is it that faith communities have in common? Because we might think to ourselves, well, yes, but we have a different moral outlook or we have a different language and so on. Well, that's true. But I think there's something that all faith communities have in common, as well as some secular actors as well. And that is that they are motivational specialists. Faith communities know what it takes to change a human being. They know how to touch those deep springs of desire and action in human beings. And I sense that one of the things that we need to equip our leaders to do, our church leaders to do, is to mobilize the language of faith for motivational purposes. We actually, there are such extraordinary resources in our tradition, and I spoke a little bit about those in the case of of the scriptures and the tradition of Catholic teaching. Mobilizing those resources touches and activates the deepest level of human commitment, and we know that because the history of our faith is littered with examples of people who were motivated enough to give everything. Those resources actually transformed and kind of blew into a fierce flame the desire to give and to change. And those resources haven't really been mobilized yet. Mm-hmm. I would like to see, for example, a new formation of Christian imagination, a capacity to see that the whole of creation worships God with us in the liturgy, for example, but creation is almost invisible in our liturgies. It wasn't for the early Christians. The early Christians surrounded themselves with images of plants and animals and trees, and the whole kind of panoply of the created order was there worshipping God with them. And we've kind of lost that. There needs to be a new formation of the imagination, in order to mobilize those deep, deep resource bases that are so distinctively belong to Christian communities. I'll just say one final thing about the justice point. This, I think, is the absolutely key distinctive in the political arena contribution of Catholic social teaching and of Laudato Si. And I mentioned this earlier. There cannot be a separation of the social and the ecological at all, because the world is one moral order. This is the kind of moral version of everything is connected. And by moral, I don't mean in a narrow way. I mean in terms of what is good in one sphere cannot be separated from what is good in another sphere. There is no such thing as environmental action that is not also action for justice, and vice versa. Binding those two together is the way in which we make sure that justice and environmental action can never be separated, can never be opposed. And of course, in secular environmental discourse, they quite often are. But it should be the distinctive quality of a language of faith that it doesn't allow that. Everything has to hold together. It all pulls in one single vision. And so on the militarism point, violence to the earth simply is violence to the poor, and vice versa. We have to just completely leave behind that dualism, the dualism of it's either nature or human beings. That has to be absolutely ancient history. It's simply inexcusable to think that funding, weapons and arms dealing can be thought of in a separate category from taking care of the future, because it is about the future. All of this is about the future. All of this is about being peacemakers and being merciful and being poor in spirit, and it all comes together in a single moral vision, and it's an incredibly compelling vision. And we need to get better and better and better at putting forth that vision in a powerful way. And that calls for exactly what everybody has been talking about, right? It means passion, not hysteria. That's so important. It means avoiding a depressive message, but at the same time not being naive. It means constantly thinking of new and creative ways to represent the Christian vision, the cosmic vision, in a way that motivates and enlivens people. I've talked for long enough, but I really think that union of the social and the ecological is one of the really important contributions that Christian communities can make, and they must make it at that highest political level.
Thank you, Carmody. That's I think we are agreeing, aren't we, on so much in terms of the priorities we have and the work that we've got to do. And it's very clear that we've got to get the message out there that we can be powerful in our response, but we've got to be more active in what we're doing and more articulate in taking our place in our democratic society and saying what we really believe and what our leaders should be empowered to do on our behalf. So I think there's good agreement here, but and expressed in hope, but we need that sense of action and urgency among ourselves. We got another question.
So
yeah.
Oh, Lydia?
Yes, I think there was a question on how we get governments to support change to or transitioning to electric cars and public transport and making them affordable. I think for me, what I would like to answer that question is really indicating earlier on the need to for governments to provide more detail in terms of how they're going to end fossil fuels and transition to renewable energy systems. I think really so far what we see is that governments are, yes, providing a vision towards a cleaner or low carbon economy or even society. But right now what we see is a lack of infrastructure that will be able to be put in place to make sure that that transition happens. And one of the costs of actually having electric cars, for now, we know that technology is still behind in terms of improving the battery storage. I think this is one of the reasons why electric cars could be expensive right now until we find better technologies to prove that. I believe in the future we'll be able to have them cheaper. But for me, the critical part is really understanding that there is a lost opportunity by governments really not transitioning to renewable energies. Quite frankly, speaking, what we know is that renewable energy sources are becoming quite cheap, and we have seen fossil fuel industries pushing back that transition. That is pretty much one of the reasons why these electric cars are becoming more expensive as we see going forward. But in essence, what I wanted to highlight is that it's not necessarily having electric cars, but is the type of electricity or the energy production coming from renewable energy that needs to address carbon emissions, not necessarily the cars that others are highlighting.
Is there still time to come back with one more answer? I'm sure we could go on all night. Bishop John, is there time for us to have one more?
I think Lidlin is about to address us, so I think we'd better pass over to her. Thank you very much, everybody. Lidlin.
Thank you.
We cannot hear you, Lindlin.
Lindlin's on mute.
There we are.
We can go on for, ages and ages. And what a brilliant way to, in the middle of the second week of the COP to, come together and talk about the urgency of the crisis that we all face. And Lorna, we are just running out of time, but there will be space for more discussions. Mine is just to come in here and say a big thank you to Durham University, specifically the Equipping Christian Leadership in the Age of Science project and Laudato Si movement for this fabulous collaboration, for this fabulous webinar that we've put together. Indeed, joining our forces together as communities, as faith communities, to come and really address the climate crisis. Bishop John Arnold, you have been amazing in your busy schedule, coming from Glasgow, marching with us in the rain. You still found the time to join us, and thank you for your warm leadership in these conversations. And just to say my heartfelt thanks. I mean, I've been sitting in the background following these conversations and learning and drawing in from all the knowledge that has been shared here. My heartfelt thanks to all the distinguished panelists. You've participated at the COPs from in person, from afar, and some of you still intend to stay till the end of the COP. And for some of us here in Glasgow, it's been a couple of days of really, working, following negotiations, working in the rain, marching, singing together, praying together, but you're all still here. Dr. Lorna, I so appreciate your reflections around the two COPs. One inside, that shows the draft that has come out that is a non-starter, but also the communities of faith and other communities who are outside really demonstrating the power of the urgency, speaking together with one voice. Thank you for reflecting and sharing your concerns around the disconnect, between those two COPs happening here in Glasgow. And Dr. Kamidi, it's such a pleasure to be here again with you. We've shared the platform together. We've talked together before. And thank you for bringing that hope, that voice of hope that Laudato Si does. It encourages all of us as Catholics, as people of faith, to continue being the beacon of hope, to keep on shining our light out there. And Francisca, your remarks so passionately about, this is not a polarized discussion. Climate and biodiversity is not something that we can ignore. It's something that is here for us. And your clarion call for each one of us to start with ourselves. It's so clear that we are all God's creature, and all the creatures around us, we need to care for it all. Lydia, you and I have worked these corridors of COP, hey, together in there, and also in the streets of Glasgow. And thank you for sharing your reflections from the blue zone inside the negotiating spaces, and for really talking about what is happening there, the financial agreements, the deals that we are not seeing, the transparency of it all, but most importantly about the billions and the trillions which are being talked about, and sharing with us that the people who matter most, who need those trillions and billions that we can talk about, till we're blue in the face, are the small-scale farmers and those who are already experiencing loss and damage. Father Eduardo, thank you for sharing your reflections on our common home, and not as creatures of this planet. Human beings are not to be in a position of dominion, but as carers, as partakers, and also sharing in the reciprocity of our common home. There's some amazing women, ladies who've been working behind the scenes to make this possible. Theodore, Caroline, Raquel, We are so grateful. Laudato Si Movement, Durham University, we are so grateful for all your work behind the scenes from afar. You have surely been with us through this COP and in making this webinar happen. Also, Gabriel, who has been managing the technical details. I must say there's some two amazing people. There's Jane here and there's Jonathan, who are not in the scene. You will not see them in the room, but they are with us in Glasgow. They've made sure that this happens. They've been live with us throughout, whether it be in the conference rooms, whether it be in the rains, and actually just to make this webinar happen, they've been with us. The Ignatian Spiritual Center has been our host here in Glasgow, having so many meetings with us, hosting us, providing tea and coffee, giving us food. Even when we were marching, they've been with us all throughout. And I must say, they have provided the equipment and the tech that we needed to operate from Glasgow. So we are very grateful. To all of you who have joined us online in this struggle, in prayers, in spirit, in this conversation, we are grateful that we're part of this journey to make the climate crisis a history. We thank you. Let us continue being the lights. Let us keep being the light that shines. As Pope Francis says, many things have to change course, but we as humans, being above all, we need to be the first change. We have the power to be the change. Thank you. Father John, please say a prayer for us.
Certainly. God of love, show us our place in this world as channels of your love for all the creatures of this earth, for not one of them is forgotten in your sight. Enlighten those who possess power and money, that they may avoid the sin of indifference, that they may love the common good, advance the weak, and care for this world in which we live. The poor and the earth are crying out. O Lord, seize us with your power and light. Help us to protect all life, to prepare for a better future, for the coming of your kingdom of justice, peace, love, and beauty. Praise be to you. Amen. And may Almighty God bless you all, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We're now back. We have to go back into the room. We need to say thank you properly too.